Perfect. You see the slides okay?
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here and kind of talking across to another country is very exciting. And thank you to all of those handling the tech as well, so that I don't have to. So today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the kinds of quandaries, I guess, and challenges that came with the writing of my book, which is called Skinning Empire, as you've heard, this kind of environmental and embodied history of taxidermy production. And this book looks at taxidermy production in Britain and the British Empire. So I'm essentially going to talk you through some of the different kinds of questions that I was faced with when trying to tell this history and these stories. And these are kind of fundamental questions like, how do you tell the history of something that is dead and displayed and that cannot write and express its own history and produce its own primary sources? How do we also, and this is a really key one, how do we make sense of something that is really the product of quite extreme kind of layers of colonial violence, which is something I'm going to be talking about a little bit more today. Like, can we and should we center the more than human world, kind of animals in this history? Just a note, this probably kind of goes without saying, really, but there are descriptions of this violence in this talk, as well as pictures of dead animals too. So through this book, I track animal specimens, animal skins from British colonial hunting grounds where animals were selected as specimens of science. And they were eyed up as what I call potential taxidermy. And what I mean by this is that they were seen as if they were specimens before, a finger had even pulled on the trigger or kind of sliced them open with a scalpel. And then I follow the journey of these specimens through imperial networks, traveling by horse, by camel, sometimes by elephant, by railway, by ship, to taxidermy studios and then exhibitions and then museums in Britain. So I think curation kind of comes into this in a broad sense long before creatures had even entered the museum, right? As they were already being kind of selected and shaped with these expectations of that kind of museum future kind of firmly in mind. We know, of course, that hunters selected animals with vividly coloured skins, with decorated skins, with impressive horns. So you get this kind of this shaping of the animal body around cultural expectations in the hunting field way before that kind of official museum history starts. This kind of idealized future state of the museum object, I guess, kind of playing out previously. So just as a kind of quick example of this, and anyone who's heard me talk before knows that I'm a bit obsessed with this man. This is Charles Peel that you can see on the screen, this kind of really prolific big head game hunter from around the turn of the 20th century. And he mainly hunted in places like the British Protectorate of Somaliland. And he was hunting initially to create his own private museum, which he curated and ran in Oxford. Eventually, the upkeep of this museum became too difficult, and he donated his collection to the RAM, the museum in Exeter, in the early 20th century. Now, he was traveling with this hunting party made up of Somali trackers, guides, skinners, cooks, and porters. This is in the late 19th century. And these Somali workers that he was traveling with and that he employed were kind of heavily involved in preparing the animal body, removing flesh, carrying skins and horns, preparing the specimens with poisons like arsenic, and also kind of cooking and tending to the animals within the caravan as well. Now, this was incredibly difficult work. These workers were subjected to kind of very extreme conditions, poor treatment, a lack of provisions, and sometimes they were killed by the animals that they were sent out on foot to track. So we know that this is a history that has not been kind of included in traditional display labels and curatorial practices, although this is very much kind of changing. But we obviously need to remember this kind of hidden labor when we are observing and looking at museum specimens today. we can say that kind of many hands shaped the physical preparation of an animal specimen. And sometimes those were kind of forced hands. So there are kind of unequal systems of power at play here. And we can see these specimens as being really kind of entirely bound up in the colonial system and the violence enacted by that system against people, against animals, and against the kind of wider, more than human world. Okay, so that's kind of one thing that I am interested in and think about a lot in this book. And I make this kind of central argument around time. I'm just going to kind of talk to you a little bit around how that fits, what I've just talked about fits together with time. So we know that hunters, we know that taxidermists, we know that museum curators all treated their animal bodies in relation to what we might call kind of different time regimes. I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. Essentially, they tried to kind of freeze an animal in time through processes like mounting, like displaying, and creation and curation. So we might think of this as the way that nature was kind of subjected to human time, colonial time, museum time, this kind of time of order, of taxonomy, of systemization, and kind of preservation. This desire to make life kind of controllable, essentially, and orderable, if you like. And of course, we can see this desire to preserve and to take from the natural world across many different examples to do with kind of resource extraction across many different examples in relation to colonialism. So we could say that kind of taxidermy represents a kind of slowing and an ending of time across many different scales at this kind of individual level for the animal and also for like the wider species, right? This is about trying to control nature, you could say. But the natural world is also this kind of place that has its own rhythms and its own kind of directions. So the taxidermist Roland Ward noted in his Sportsman's Handbook that, quote, during the rains in India, the air is charged with moisture and it is difficult to dry anything by simple exposure. And he was talking there about the drying of skins. So skins rotted, they nurtured molds. Hunters complained that some skins, when laid out to dry around campsites, were stolen, quite loaded language, taken by animals like hyenas and dragged off into the night. Others might be kind of pecked to bits by vultures. They might also be broken into pieces by the actions of the caravan, of kind of lifting and jostling skins and carrying them over stony terrain. And when hunters shot aquatic animals like hippos, they often kind of sank to the bottom of that river and might resurface several hours later. And it was really hard to know when they would resurface, if at all. So this is all kind of stuff that we might expect during, transit. But importantly, I found some continuity too when specimens kind of entered museums and exhibitions. And I was kind of surprised, I guess, by this continuity. So rather than becoming fixed, rather than becoming timeless and static, these creatures, of course, continued to interact with their surroundings. So this is an illustration that was drawn by a friend and fellow academic, Aurora Moxon, trying to capture a sense of these kind of different timelines that might come together in relation to taxidermy. So I found in museums kind of other examples from the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, around things like insect infestations, like ongoing infestations, but also kind of more low-key things. Feathers falling out, creatures fading under the action of kind of light, just generally the kind of wear and tear that comes with a being in the world. And also, I think importantly, creates a distance from the animal, the living animal that specimen is supposed to convey and represent. So just to give you another example of this, in 1933, the taxidermists Gerard and Sons paid a visit to the Royal Albert Memorial Museum to attend to this collection that you can see on the screen. Sorry if you're missing some of the quotes. And this kind of visitation was overseen by the museum curator, Frederick Rowley. And as you can see, or you might not be able to see in this quote, they returned to these creatures because they were falling apart, because they were aging, because their seams were kind of breaking apart, essentially, and they were assessed as needing curation, needing taxidermy, needing to be repaired in some way. It was also judged that they needed new grasses and mosses, adding to the displays to make them seem naturalistic and realistic, and that the polar bears needed a shampoo with a, quote, good sud making soap. So, as you can see in this quote, some of the creatures were literally falling apart at the seams, and an antelope needed literal patching, which was done by Mr. Cook, the taxidermist, and he matched in pieces of a kind of replacement antelope skin to do this kind of patching. And we can see in this example too how we get the kind of replication of times past as well. So in this image, you can see that this Peel collection was essentially trying to recreate the Somali kind of hunting scene that he had experienced himself. So we get this replication too of kind of colonial spaces. So I'm really interested in these kind of stories of repair and return and kind of circling that come about with curation and these kind of ongoing experiences of taxidermy. So I kind of trace these stories of decay and repair and return, and also in some cases, theft across kind of different mediums. Okay, so this left me in something of a quandary. I kind of wanted to tell these histories as they were appearing in my sources because I thought they were really interesting. There is a kind of unexpected dynamism, I guess, that kind of comes out in these stories despite these animals being dead, but also very much because they are dead. And I was kind of interested in how you quantify this and write about this, whilst also accounting for those quite extreme systems of violence that produce museum specimens and displays and continue to be enacted through their display today. Can you talk about these things at the same time, was my kind of question. And eventually, through doing this work, I kind of came to the decision or the realization that these things don't cancel each other out. That these acts of dynamism, these little kind of things, actually operate kind of within that wider structure of violence that make up what we might call the Anthropocene, which has its roots in colonialism. So actually, it is by looking at how these kind of things operate within that wider system of violence that we can learn really about the ongoing complexity of human and kind of more than human interactions in the past and present. That we should avoid this tendency to kind of oversimplify or kind of flatten, I guess, these kinds of histories of violence potentially, or kind of shoehorn them into a box that fits our expectations. I think it kind of remains significant that a single kind of mouldy animal specimen could disrupt a kind of Victorian obsession with preservation and potentially those kind of damaging ideas of progress that kind of course through Victorian imaginations too. And that is sometimes through their deadness, sometimes through the kind of entropy that comes with that, and those processes of kind of decay, but also those very human ideas of culture and repair that come with that too. And in this kind of way, these animal remains could kind of play with human expectations and also human emotions. People got very stressed out by this. There was lots of anxiety essentially around the deterioration of animal mounts. And this is something that I started to kind of refer to as the nuisance making qualities of animal specimens, right? And their associated ecosystems or ecologies, if you like. That these were kind of nuisance makers. So I think perhaps when considering processes around kind of specimen creation and curation and display, maybe we can kind of stretch the idea of kind of what a curator is, or kind of what curation is, I guess. You know, can a beetle nibbling on a bit of horn be considered within these wider structures of curation as someone who is kind of, as a being that is kind of shaping an animal specimen? Anna Singh refers to the, quote, feral nature of the Anthropocene. And I think this kind of idea of feralness really comes alive in these kinds of examples, that these nuisance-causing elements don't actually ask us to look away from the violence, but ask us to think about how that plays out on the ground and also kind of through bodies. Ultimately, we are kind of surrounded by the shells and the husks of dead things. They kind of make up our cultures and our societies. And we need to kind of see these for what they are. And they remind us that it is the kind of small things and the small stories that can kind of connect to the much bigger things. Those questions of loss, those questions of extinction, those questions of climate crisis, whatever it may be. But there is also a kind of a small scale kind of beautiful chaos that kind of come out of those too. How am I for time then?
Coming to the end.
Okay. There was just a kind of final thing that I wanted to very quickly touch on, which I will whiz through and not really talk about very much. So the other, apologies for the dead right on the screen. Just the final thing that I wanted to talk about too was that and I can talk about this more in questions, was that as part of the process of kind of doing this work, I realized that there were lots of things missing in my sources, right? That yes, I could be reading this really essentially kind of colonial archive, but that this was coming from quite a privileged point of view, written by those in the past who had a very certain lens on what taxidermy is and should be, how it should be displayed, how it should be curated, etc. And one of the things that I noticed was that there were very few descriptions of the reality of kind of meeting animal death in these sources, that they were missing out on some of the kind of sensory aspects of this work too. So things like smells, things like sounds, things that took you beyond the directive within kind of taxidermy handbooks. So I decided to do a taxidermy course to try and fill in some of those kind of absences. So what I'm really interested in as well is how we can braid together like a historical approach using an archive, like I've been discussing, with I guess, a craft-based approach too, that tries to fill in some of those gaps. Ultimately, I came to the decision that actually there is not much that you can learn about real experience of the taxidermist, of what it felt like to be a taxidermist from doing this work. But that was valuable in itself too, right? So this really allowed me to kind of reflect on what we can as historians know about the past, how close we can get to our subjects. But it also gave me a real appreciation, importantly, for the role that the animal played within this process. I was intrinsically like guided by the animal skin, by its corners with its holes that needed filling, by that disgust that I felt in doing this as a vegetarian practicing in the 21st century, by all of those things that kind of made this experience my own and helped me really reflect on the historian's role. Is that probably the end of time? All right, I will bring that to an end there. Those are essentially my thoughts. Thank you for listening.
We can dig in more in the Q&A. Just get. Stop sharing. I think if Lisa.
Yeah, great. Okay, good stuff. Thank you, Alice. So next we have Lisa Myers. And Lisa Myers is a curator and an artist who's interested in interdisciplinary collaboration and focuses on various media and materials, including video, audio, printmaking, digital arts, and socially engaged art approaches. As an associate professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University, she holds a York Research Chair in Indigenous Art and Curatorial Practice and is the coordinator of the Environmental Arts and Justice Programme. Myers is an off-reserve and proud member of Beausoleil First Nation and is based in both Toronto and Port Seven in Ontario. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you for that intro. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and I'm going to try something if this will work because I want to be able to read my notes at the same time. Oh, maybe I have to do that. Sorry, I should. Okay, 1 second. Just give me 1 minute. I'm so sorry for the delay. I just have to arrange some things here. Should have done that before. Okay. There we go. Okay, awesome. I got it. I got it. Thank you for your patience in that moment. Let's go to okay, thank you. I was just doing a bit of paper. It's an online version of paper shuffling that I'm doing right now. Okay. Okay, thanks so much. I wanted to thank you, thank the organizers here at York and in Bristol for inviting me to this panel, and to the research assistants who support this series, and also want to acknowledge my co-panelists and say, welcome them and say how glad I am to be sharing this space with you. Thank you for the intro. I'm going to start with this image, which you can look at while I speak. It's a artwork by Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore, and it's called Speaking to Their Mother, where she created this large megaphone to actually speak to land. And this was in response to a conflict between Mohawk peoples and the Canadian government in 1990, where she decided she didn't want to have her conversations about land anymore with the government, but to speak to land directly. So this is a sort of the tone. I think it's an important artwork and interesting in this conversation about more than human. I come to this panel on more than human in curation as someone who has long understood curation as a relational practice, working closely with artists, collaborating on exhibition theses, and supporting the development of new artworks for exhibition contexts. I want to note that I am speaking here as an artist/curator, where my artistic and curatorial practices are not always distinct, but continually inform one another. Today, I'll briefly discuss my work with this artist's work, garden work, Mike McDonald, his medicine and butterfly gardens, and then turn to my own practice, which considers time, land, and plant relations through blueberries, thinking within the temporal worlds of plants. Since I am speaking across the pond, so to speak, I feel I should offer that I work with contemporary art and artists here in Canada. Also, I want to offer some more context about the context I work in. If I speak of my curatorial practice in isolation from my art practice, it is grounded in creating space for Indigenous artists within museums and art institutions. And this work builds on the foundational efforts of earlier Indigenous curators such as Gerald McMaster, Leanne Martin, Tom Hill, and many others. I reflect that as an Anishinaabe person myself, I am also interested in considering the history of misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples here in North America, asserting space for modern and contemporary artworks from artists from Anishinaabe and Indigenous artists whose presence in the museums historically was often relegated to ethnographic museum departments. So that's the broader context that I bring, and maybe it catches people up a little bit. The curators I mentioned earlier, the few that I mentioned earlier, challenged the organizing exhibitions of modern and contemporary Indigenous art within major Canadian institutions, building critical discourse, establishing an Indigenous contemporary art scene here in Canada and North America. This is, of course, a very brief account of the decades of labor, and importantly, the work of Indigenous curators and artists has never been confined to the art world alone. It responds directly to the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands and territories, and often artists' work take up those, make work in response to that too. However, I would say there's also a complexity of aesthetic and all of that which comes with in-depth arts practices. Contemporary Indigenous curators and artists have long addressed the injustices and power relations shaped by colonial policies such as the potlatch ban, as well as the fraught relationship between Indigenous peoples and museums. At the same time, they propose responsible forms of care for art and cultural belongings, approaches that include reparation, remediation, and repatriation, both within and beyond museum collections. So as I reflect on my work with plants, I consider how plants within Anishinaabe terms are our first teachers. We consider them our first teachers. In our origin stories, they exist before we do. Mohawk and Anishinaabe scholar Vanessa Watts, in her writing on place thought, frames what she calls an Indigenous point of view in which ecosystems are understood as societies, that humans are also part of these societies. And these societies are, she explains, have ethical structures, interspecies treaties, and systems of interpretation and responsibilities as active members of society. Non-human beings influence how humans organize themselves. So I link Watts' analysis more specifically to Anishinaabe worldviews, where all living beings are understood in relation and indeed as relatives. From Anishinaabe clan systems, we have a clan system that outlines governance, it outlines our relationship to each other. Different nations have different clan systems specific to communities. It can be as specific to communities as well. And to understand plants, and this understands plants and animals as our relations, and also other items may be thought to be not living, but as rocks or stones as ancestors as well, our grandmothers or grandfathers. And so bringing this into the curatorial framework of relationality, I want to foreground these relationships. And I like to, in my practice, gather people together to exchange ideas, to think about spaces, creating spaces of sustenance. And so that sustenance is not only, I would say, like food related as in ingesting food, but in terms of like creating spaces where we can think together and think with plants as well. So I wanted to talk about my work with the artist Mike McDonald, who created medicine and butterfly gardens across the country. And the origin of this work was, he was working with First Nations in British Columbia, which is near the west side of Canada, in the interior, doing some documentation of areas that were slotted or determined to be future clear cuts for forestry. And they were documenting the different medicine plants in that valley. And when he was taking pictures of plants, they were these butterflies kept landing on them. So he had a lot of pictures. And when he consulted the group he was working with, included elders, one elder told him the butterflies would lead him to the medicine plants he needed. And so he started researching, this artist started researching the interdependency of butterflies, between butterflies and different plants, and became quite a knowledgeable person about these relationships between the plants and the butterflies, and as pollinators, as and so built these gardens across the country at different galleries, museums, out usually in sort of urban spaces, like out on the lawn of different art centers and things like that. The only existing one still is this one at Walter Phillips Gallery and in Alberta at the Banff Center. It's a garden that exists between two large buildings. It's in a national park, the Banff Center National Park, which has its own sort of regulations around what can be planted, what can be brought into the park, and all of this. But it's the first national park. It's the largest, I believe, or one of the largest. This is a shot of it. There's a path through and gardens. The gardens are on either side of the path, and you can see sort of the buildings. So our close engagement with the McDonald's Gardens deepened our understanding of its significance. We were thinking about, when we thought about these gardens as artworks, we were I was working with a team and we were foregrounding this idea of radical care to describe the relational ways of acting or thinking and feeling with human and non-human beings, the plants being that. And that these gardens as artworks, this garden is part of the collection of the official art collection of the Walter Phillips Gallery, and how these gardens demanded something different in terms of care in comparison to art objects in the vault, the art objects that would include taxidermy, perhaps, but mostly this collection was contemporary art. So it demanded people to think about land outside of the walls of the gallery. And I think that's a really important point if we think about the first slide that I showed you. As artworks, McDonald's butterfly gardens have to have a care plan. However, over the last 20 years or so, the seeds or the plants that he planted have spread. Rhizomes have nestled beyond their original planting, and branches reach far from the original saplings. So these plants are, I guess we could even reference the feral, the concept of feral. They don't recognize borders. They don't recognize, seeds fly. They get carried by mice. They get carried by birds, etc. So I was thinking about this collective care, and I was thinking also in turning to this Potawatomi philosopher and environmental justice scholar, Kyle White, because I was relating this idea of care and radical care to this idea of epistemologies of coordination. And he anchors this in this idea of where there's a coordinated, responsible action grounded in longstanding kinship relations. So these relations that I mentioned, that we think of plants as our original teachers, he refers to this idea of epistemologies of coordination. So grounded in longstanding kinship relations, which acknowledge and respond to constant environmental change, this stands in contrast to a crisis epistemology, which frames change as sudden, unprecedented, and exceptional. So thinking about, if we think in terms of our relations to plants and that being an ongoing part of our lives, there's change that happens at a different kind of pace. And I think he's also addressing this kind of crisis idea, how to sidestep a crisis mode and be in a mode of sort of thriving and living. I wanted to move out of that and into some work that I did with blueberries specifically, and because I feel like there is a kind of way that I've used blueberries in my work over the years. Blueberries came from a story from my grandfather, which was a survival story. So thinking about, in referencing what Kyle White talks about as a kind of epistemology of coordination, there was this idea of like blueberries in my family that really was part of a survival story of my grandfather as he left residential school and was able to sustain himself on blueberries for a long walk that he took to get home. And so I've taken it sort of out of that story and taken it into different contexts of the blueberry itself. This is a map of a walk, an augmented reality audio walk that I created. for the Museum of Contemporary Art a couple of years ago. And you would get this map and you would do this route. And at the different route stops, you would access different portals. And so this is an area of the city that is highly, like, quickly gentrifying from an industrial area to become condos and fancy coffee shops, and of course the museum itself. There still is the Nestle Canada, the Nestle chocolate factory. So in the story that you listen to in the audio walk, you catch a whiff of the chocolate in the air, and that in the story it transforms you and it heightens your senses, and then you are. And it explains why there are all these portals that you that you encounter. So in the portals, the blueberry appears again to remind us that, and in this way, I use the blueberry as a character to remind us that we are on indigenous land, or even just to remind people that you're in an urban space, but you're still on land that has life that you're in relation with. And so the blueberry becomes this character that reminds us of this. I think if you hold your phone up, if you have your phone closely, like, not that, I mean, a lot of people do. If you hold your phone up to the screen right now and hit open, and if you, I don't know if it'll work for people in Bristol, but if you allow all of this augmented reality platform to, if you accept all the permissions asked, you should be able to tap your screen and you'll plant some blueberries around the space that you're in right now. And if you tap the screen probably more than 6 times, you'll see the blueberry starts to turn into other objects, like the railroad track or a sumac drupe. And this is to reflect, I don't know if it's working for everyone, but this is to reflect the rail path that is along this region, along this route, is to represent the sort of rebuilding of the railway path, which is part of the redevelopment of this area, and to think about the sumacs that were ripped out, that the train tracks are this prevailing sort of, I would say, not only an icon, but an infrastructure that, you know, was part of the colonial project and the expansion of Canada and establishing the country of Canada. Anyway, this is the way that the blueberry is reminding us of where we are and reminding us of land, but also of the dynamics that are happening in this process. So this was one artwork that I did, which was an audio walk. The last piece that I wanted to talk to that also references blueberries and brings us to this place of blueberry time is work that I did for the Bonavista Biennial this past summer. And the Bonavista Biennial happens in Newfoundland, province of Newfoundland, on the Bonavista Peninsula. And so there's many sites around the peninsula that different artists set up. And I was given this site in Keels, Newfoundland. It's a community hall. So I had the entire community hall. And the entire community hall was surrounded by blueberry plants, which were in full berryness, if I can use that term, berryness in August when my show was on. Part of the show had prints that were made with blueberry pigment. Part of it was also what I'm going to talk to you about now. And that was, so I worked with blueberry plants on this site where I was commissioned a new artwork in Newfoundland. The site entirely surrounded by blueberries. I sought to think of the region my family comes from here in Ontario, which is also a blueberry area where blueberries grow, and this place in Newfoundland. So kind of trying to, how do I respond to a place I'm not from and I haven't been to? One aspect of the work was to invite visitors to visit the blueberries outside of the building, not to just come to the building to see the artwork, but to almost commune with them using a sundial to orientate them. So I created this sundial design. It was in a postcard form that people could cut out and use. They would point the top part of the arc in the north direction, and that would give them the accurate time with the shadow, as you can see that shadow point. But instead of having numbers from our conventional time, I created a scale of the blueberries development from blossom to berry. So I asked people to enter this temporal kind of shift, suspend their sense of disbelief, and enter into blueberry time. And in blueberry time, it's a certain pace of seasonality. It's a certain pace of slowness. It's a certain place for contemplation. It's a place where we let go of the numbers on the clock. It's a place where we can be in relation. And so I was asking them to go outside, find some blueberries to hang out with, orientate themselves to this place. And this was the function of the blueberry arc. So I would say, as you read this at the end, it says, you now have a reading of solar time in blueberry terms. Add your time to the large arc in the community hall. So everyone could mark the time on a very big arc that they were there, and all the time was in blueberry time. And the beautiful thing about blueberry time is you're never late. So coming from a perspective that considers relationship and relatives, in this case, plants, I also did a project with a collective of students this past summer, and we created also grape time, which the grape arc represents York University's time, because if you look around, there's a lot of riverbed grapes everywhere. And so grapes became our time. And so I'm at the end of my time, and unfortunately we're not in blueberry or grape time. So I just want to conclude that saying, rather in these terms, this is sort of an adjacency of humans as part of the ecology, thinking about Vanessa Watt's society, that rather than speaking nearby in relation to more than humans, I consider, as what Watts points out, where we have this social link, we're relatives to these more than humans. And I want to thank you for your time today. Miigwech. I hope I didn't go over time. Thank you. Hopefully I wasn't on mute the whole time.
No, you weren't. We learned all about blueberry time and we loved it. And the blueberries did work in Bristol as well, which was fabulous.
Oh, awesome. Have fun.
Yeah. Right, I'll just share Isla's slides now. Is that working? Can you guys see that?
Yes, can see it.
Excellent. Okay, good stuff. So thank you, Lisa. So finally, we have Isla Gladstone. So Isla is a senior curator for the Natural Science Collections at Bristol Museums. She delivers practice-based research, co-production and engagement, exploring both the contemporary scientific relevance of natural science collections and their intersections with decolonisation, ecological resilience and social justice. Isla is appointed to the UK Museums Association's Climate Justice Steering Group and is a recent chair of the UK Subject Specialist Network, the Natural Sciences Collections Association. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your beautiful talk, and love learning about blueberry time, and Alice as well. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me here today. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge that this talk engages with colonial and imperial histories in museums and natural science collections, that those continue to shape our institutions and that they affect us differently depending on our positions and lived histories. And the work I'm going to talk about reflects critically on these legacies and considers how they might be approached differently today. So as Andy said, I work at Bristol Museums and Archives. We are a large multi-site service covering 5 museums as well as archives and environmental records centre, and part of Bristol City Council's Culture and Creative Industries team. I have a broad role within that, so I work across a huge collection of natural sciences varying from fossils, rocks, minerals to plants and taxidermy, and work with a small team of 2 curators. And my work covers all aspects you might imagine in terms of museum curation, from collections management through to fundraising, through to community participation work, engagement, etc. But here I wanted to focus in on a space we've been working in for the past few years, which is really relevant to how the conversation about more than human relating. And that's what is currently termed the World Wildlife Gallery at Bristol Museum and Art Gallery. So you can see on this slide at the left, one of the displays from this gallery, which is, despite its name, primarily taxidermied birds and mammals taken from outside of Europe pre-1960s and interpreted still, as they always have been, only through a Western scientific lens. And this is despite the really complex ethics, the local and global histories, the cultural connections, and the non-humans presence in this space. Broadly, as you can see to the right, it's seen as a sort of family space. And this is a wayfinder that highlights Alfred, the gorilla, who was a famous gorilla who lived at Bristol Zoo from 1930. But in reality, perhaps this photograph shows it better. It's an underinvested space, which last had quite a low budget relabel about 25 years ago. The lighting is failing. The interpretation doesn't meet modern standards of access and engagement or equity and respect. It doesn't reflect the museum's behind the scenes work and a much more dynamic contemporary programme. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, these are the displays from the pre-war museum, Victorian Museum. It doesn't look like it's changed hugely, although actually the displays here are really just a remnant of that Victorian display. And actually the fact they haven't been updated doesn't really disguise their original purpose, as it might do in some other museums where taxidermy has been reused in more contemporary ways. We can really see that here. And also it is still on display. Many museums in the UK have removed taxidermy without going through that process of acknowledging and working through what it might mean to acknowledge these histories today without attending to it. So this is an important space to be reflecting on relations to non-humans and to each other in a city that has centres, is recognised as a global centre for wildlife storytelling. And we know the potential of this space to create a space for conversation, much needed conversation, through things like this intervention we did a few years ago, which generated international attention, which responded to children writing to us, as well as global declarations of biodiversity loss. You can read some of the quotes. Hopefully I can't actually read them on my screen, but children essentially describing how they were they're heartbroken by the injustice in this space, but particularly that the lack of information, that the animals don't have a chance. You know, it's about the injustice, but it's about the storytelling and how they knew the story, which they'd actually found out on going back to school and researching the story of these animals, that's important to them understanding today. And I drew this quote from Alice's work. Alice did some work with us at Bristol Museum. And that idea, which people have been touching on, of time. So the space looks very fixed, but actually it's not. And Alice's quote spoke to me: the roles of skin and of curators and taxidermists were not fixed, and the museum constituted a changing landscape. This is about the museum in the kind of early 1900s. But actually, all of these spaces can look very fixed. They have actually changed through time, and they will continue to change. So in the top left of the image, we have the Bristol Institution, where the collections were established in 1823. And the establishment of the collections is heavily tied in with Bristol's role as an imperial port and with wealth derived from the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. Then the collections moved up to this building on the lower left, which was built as a purpose-built natural history museum in 1872. But as you can see to the right, it was heavily damaged in World War I. And the collections moved across the building to the left of the old Natural History Museum, sorry, to the right in your photo, which is now Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, originally built as an art gallery. So there's been a kind of ongoing change physically, as well as in the way these collections have been presented and curated. And so we've been doing work to reflect on the potential for these collections to help us to understand these imperial histories and how they are entangled with the development of natural history knowledge, particularly in our city, and then the potential for sort of reimagining and repair. So to give some examples of what we mean, to the left here, you can see a smooth chameleon that was first described by the museum's second curator, Samuel Stutchbury, in 1837. This chameleon was taken from what is now called Gabon, by a ship that was owned by the kings. They'd had various names, but the king and sons at this point. And this company was instrumental in opening up the palm oil trade from the mid-1810s, which Bristol played a huge role in. So it opened up areas of Africa that hadn't been accessible for palm oil previously, after the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807. So again, we can see this entanglement of our city history with extractive processes, and here Stutchbury is benefiting from those networks and giving this potentially, well, I imagine, a new name to this chameleon. We also have things like the hunting trophies. These are from Major Swain, which aren't on display anymore. I can think they're less easy to fit into a sort of scientific narrative of the modern museum. But he basically records 17 trips where he explores and shoots big game. So again, that kind of power and hierarchy that Alice was talking to. And then further to the right, slightly later collections, which these are a collection of plants collected by a mother and son, all which came to Bristol between sort of they collected between 1910 and 1960s. So these were plants coming into Bristol through its port, but growing in wastelands and spaces that you wouldn't expect survival. So these plants have an interesting story of, well, partly with terminology. They're also termed alien plants, and there's a lot of unpicking to do there, but growing in these spaces. So interesting, lots of interesting stories to reflect on how we think and relate to non-humans, to the ecological crisis, and to each other today. And lots of difficult histories, and the work we've been doing explores this really. How do we start to, this is from some community consultations, how we start to normalize these conversations, which are still very difficult to have in institutional spaces, on an educational basis where we still allow diversity of community voice to breathe through. So the way we've been doing that in Bristol is through collaboration, through creative practice, through inviting particularly artists from backgrounds previously marginalized in natural history to use art to start to explore new ways, like reimagining of the way we can think through these collections at this time. So the top example is by an artist called Jessica Ashman, who worked from the collection which is on the lower left, which is a collection of plants, pressed plants taken from Jamaica, collected in Jamaica in the late 1700s by a Bristol physician who'd retired out there for his health. Very entangled with the history of enslavement and exploitation and botany. And here Jessica is sharing the voices that she couldn't find in the archive, and foregrounding different relationships to plants. So it's a really moving and powerful exhibition. And this also builds on work we're also doing to reconnect with the Natural History Museum in Jamaica, who don't have a collection that stretches back as early as ours. So we're looking at that in terms of return of information and data. And the bottom pictures, colleagues had a grant to travel out and revisit these sites together with curators from the Natural History Museum in Jamaica and recollect plants, understand how sites had changed, so a sharing of knowledge. Another piece we've been doing is with a local amazing agency called Rising Arts Agency, who represent young artists from underrepresented backgrounds. So here around, you can see incredible kind of conversations going on around this table, specifically focused on the World Wildlife Gallery. And just to give you a flavour of the kinds of conversations we had, which were broad and diverse from kind of institutional level to collections level to individual level, looking at the different lenses we could represent the current displays through, you can see on the left, to going out to communities and then bringing conversations back to the museum, which is the elephant in the room on the top right, to considering the hierarchy and the problematic structures within these colonial displays through a queer lens. We consulted with young people of Indigenous heritage, and this project to the right, A Journey Home, is one that's still ongoing. Amazing young artist called Iman Sultan West, artist and creative practitioner, who has been tracing the individual stories of items in the collection, understanding their provenance, and then using that to reconnect with communities here, linked communities today. So in this case, this is a pangolin that was taken to Bristol in 1829. And we managed, it just said from Africa on the label, very, very colonial, managed to trace that provenance back to Ghana. And through that, Iman has reconnected with a local grassroots organisation who work with pangolins, and we're learning together about how they teach children there about relating to pangolins. So I just shared some quotes to sort of profile that conversation and illustrating that complexity of sort of where next as we work to make change in this space. Acknowledging colonialism, words do matter. Not saying anything is like sweeping it under a rug and saying we didn't care. That there's still a lot of popularity of this kind of space despite its problems. There's a sort of need in people talking about wanting to go and see and experience these animals, but then discussions of replicas, perhaps, or not seeing real animals. Discussions about cultural representation. You know, if you just acknowledge my culture, which is very sort of traditional in the UK for natural science collections to not reference anything but scientific information, to help create that sense of belonging. Perhaps it makes it more okay to have that animal still in that museum. The sort of importance but tension of Indigenous representation in a colonial space, where currently that is as fragments, and will never be fully represented. And people talked about relearning about their heritage through problematic colonial spaces and how entangled that is. But actually what we need here is the immersion of Indigenous representatives to be able to ensure representation. We've been exploring repatriation, as I mentioned, through Aman's work, as beyond return in terms of reconnecting in ways that are led by communities and ways that are culturally relevant and needed. And I think a lot about the ethics of this space and sort of this ongoing, the tensions and the limits of this work. But speaking with Maori creators in Te Papa, they spoke about building these collections ethically again. So items that are there for the right purpose today, with the right stories, consent and consideration of where they're from, even if this may not have been there at the start, and how that changes the ethics of having material in this space. And thinking through the more than human, what does repair look like in the animal world? So really diverse and broad conversations, and we're now working through this to try and make change within this space, which I think will essentially be about becoming more transparent and creating space for conversation and ongoing creative practice and reimagining. And that was just a little link to our previous work, which I can share with the slides.
Okay, right. So we now have some time for some questions. Maybe if we take 2 minutes of thinking time, and then we can come back and take questions that come up. Questions for the whole panel, preferably, so that we can get some conversations going, I think.
Maybe please take down the final slide.
Yeah, right.
I'm here.
Thank you.
Yeah, do you guys want to come and sort of sit here, stand here?
I'm worried about turning the camera if you lose connection sound. So I think it would be best if you guys, if you want to have a seat, and as long as you guys can see them. And there was one question in the Q&A so far.
Okay.
We can start with, unless you had any that we wanted to start with.
No, you like doing that? Can you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, cool. Okay, so we have one question in the Q&A we're going to kick off with.
Oh, got two so far. Okay, nice.
Okay.
So the first one we have is, thank you by the way, for all the speakers. It's been fabulous. I've got like 7,000 questions that I can ask as well. But first we've got a question from another Alice, and it's for Alice. Alice W. They say, great presentation, Alice W. Please say more about the concept of temporality. Specifically, are there particular ways in which time shapes/drives curatorial human-animal relations? Some context, I'm a geographer, so I think a lot about how space shapes and drives relations, but I'm thinking more these days about how time plays a role. So maybe if you want to start with that, Alice, but actually I think time, as it would, came up in all of the all of the presentations. So we can kind of go from there, maybe.
Oh, well, thank you, Alice, for the question. Let me know if you can't hear me at all. I guess we're a bit further away now from mics, but hopefully it's all right. So yeah, time, I would say time is really the kind of central thing that held together the different bits of this book that I've written, essentially. And one of the kind of key things that I kind of suggest is that we need to diversify what we think of as time, essentially. That every living being has their own time and kind of interacts with ours, or has their own timelines that don't interact with ours as well, right? And that we have very set ideas around what time is, and that those come from, generally in the Western world, from quite like a colonial place as well, right? It's all about progress, it's about forwards time, all of that kind of stuff. So I guess in the book, I was trying to say that they're like using some really good scholarship, people like Deborah Bird-Rose, who's talked about like the knotted nature of like animal and human timelines, right? How this doesn't always travel in one direction in a straight line, how it's much more complicated than that. Things can go backwards, they can go forwards. So I was trying to show how, I guess, the more than human world has its own temporalities that don't stop when they enter the museum. And that these are all related to processes like that can be like decay, but also like acceleration. So, you know, like animals, yeah, essentially decaying, and that being like a quickening of time, we could say, that kind of thing. But then I'm also interested in, as I was saying, this stuff about repair. And this is, it kind of comes at the end of the book. I think about how like modern ideas around extinction, around the climate crisis, around biodiversity loss, it can be talked about using these kind of examples, right? That actually, if we're thinking about the loss of an individual specimen, that and the care that is ongoing in museums, the kind of great curatorial work that goes into thinking about these kind of questions, that actually those are about holding on to the animal as well and telling new stories. So I'm really interested in those like temporalities of care as well, I guess you could say, how that's about like repairing animals, you know, repositioning animals, retelling their stories in new ways that work in the present day, and how that's really important work to be doing within the Anthropocene, which you could also see is related to time. And so that actually recognizing the mobility and the dynamism of animals can help us to do that. It can help us to tell more complicated stories in the present potentially, and stories that we're already needing to tell around protection, around conservation, around care, and that the museum is a great place to be telling those stories, essentially.
I could chime in on that time question as well.
So
and
much.
I think it relates. It does echo some of the things you were saying. And I think like as blueberry time or grape time, these sorts of like sort of playful ways that I'm sort of inviting people in, it's a way of anchoring kind of a thought experiment. The thought experiment being inviting people to think outside of that idea of forward as progress, or time as progress, or time as forward, but time being cyclical, or time, our present time being also existing in the past and the future. I know it sounds, but I think it also has really material implications if we think of it that way, because we think about what we do now in terms of how we treat, you know, the environment, land, each other, all these sorts of conditions, you know, they are part of what happens. The resulting thing will take place in the future. So there's a kind of like, yeah, I think that the blueberry time and raspberry time apparently just popped out of my mouth. Blueberry time and grape time are, yeah, these thought experiments that do similar things of what you were saying as well, Alice. But thank you.
Anna, do you want to?
Yeah, when we were doing our work with the Young Artists from Writing Arts Agency, one of them, Lisa, wrote an incredible pantoum on time, and it was talking about this space as a feeling of, as they describe, like a no-when. Like there's a nowhere where you feel like you don't belong, or sense of place, but not such a word for a feeling of disembodiment in time. and that this, well, the lack of change, the lack of historicization of this place, but also the way we speak about these well, essentially taxidermied animals as representative of their species with no kind of, it's very apolitical, ahistorical, this lack of time. It's also something I think about in terms of the idea of colonial progress, the kind of tension and issues of trying to sort of make it all okay, or, you know, sort of sitting with these tensions as well, so not a linear time. But a museum is a really interesting place, I think, to be thinking about time, because there's all sorts of layers and circles and loops there.
Yeah, and like, yeah, even with there's like time happening on like the body level, with the body, you know, live, you know, bodies that are alive, bodies that are dead, buildings as well. I wanted to sort of open up to the room in a minute. We've just got one more in the Q&A, and then yeah, we'll open up to the room for any questions here. So this one comes from Aisha, and it's for Isla. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, when your museum introduces historical or ethical context around overseas collected taxidermy, how do visitors tend to respond? Have you noticed changes in how people engage with these displays?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we haven't made the change yet, but we have done quite a bit of audience conversation and testing already. So the change is imminent, thankfully, but we have talked to visitors who haven't necessarily been thinking about it in the space already. But once we start talking about the history or the ethical contexts, it makes sense to people. There hasn't been a resistance. And actually, when we started actually to talk about it during our Extinction Voices exhibition, and quite a lot of visitors said, thank you for making this visible. Thank you for providing a space. I can talk about this. I wanted to talk about this a lot. It hadn't felt right. I felt uncomfortable, but there wasn't a way to talk about it. And again, working with people who don't necessarily visit the museum because of what it represents, but still talking about a want to be able to talk about these histories, because it's not an easy way in. For example, in Bristol's environmental sector, which is very non-diverse, to start a conversation about deep histories behind that and structural change feels very difficult. So if an institution like a museum is making that visible and transparent, that has been welcomed so far. Yeah, but we're also really aware of how polarized conversations are at the moment. So not wanting to polarize. So giving everyone a way in, sort of meeting them where they are at, unless they're being clearly racist, or, you know, it's about providing people ways in. And I'm interested in how it will work within the natural history space, where, although it's very difficult because it's about dead animals, is it perhaps less confrontational in terms of human history? So that will be really interesting. And essentially we'll be making change and working with visitors and non-visitors and testing and having conversations, because we don't really know the answer to that. But so far it's been very welcomed.
I can imagine. I was just thinking about those quotes from those children as well, like from those letters, like what that kind of storytelling from the animal's perspective might look like, and you know, lots of interesting work to be done there. I don't know if you wanted to say anything as well, Lisa, with your artworks and exhibitions, sort of the conversations that have come from them, or how participants have responded, or
sure. Yeah, it's really different kind of context. It's really different, but I mean, with the event in Newfoundland, we had families just end up like picking berries and having, you know, it becomes, it became a sort of site of sustenance and in the very like feeding oneself. But I think the response was, I guess I was really asking people to suspend their disbelief and enter in, especially the walk. I kind of invite through the audio story that I'm telling them. I'm asking them to assume a role. Of someone who is affected by the smell of chocolate processing in the neighborhood, and to be following sort of what I explain to them as their heightened senses and things. So there's a kind of like playfulness that is sort of asked of them, and the response. I think the response is that some of the responses, like we had the Cities Institute from York do that walk in the summer that it was first introduced, that walk started, and there was just really interesting conversations about I don't know, that like delved into political ecology, but delved into urban planning, all of these sorts of things. And I think it was a kind of means for people to start reflecting more deeply on the issues that the talk was sort of touching on, in kind of in a very non-academic way, but in a way to sort of experience space in a different way. So those were some of the responses in that way. I think it's really interesting, though, to be on this panel with two people that have been, really looking at the museum collection and taxidermy, and this feeling of when I see those cases with the really crowded animals, it's a kind of, there's such a strong sense of stasis, like which I don't really know. I don't have a question about exactly, but there's a very I was just thinking in contrast to thinking about plants and being outside the bricks and mortar of the museum is it's really thought-provoking. I'm kind of going in my own mind, but I don't have a question exactly, but I'm really glad that we're in conversation together. One thing that I am very interested in, though, is if there's not another question on our list, which I don't think there is. Oh, there is. Sorry, I'll stop talking. But I'm really interested in the plant pressings, because we started getting into plant pressings, and I'd love to talk to you more, but we'll do that another day off screen, perhaps.
No, I think that there's definitely room for conversation. I just wanted to check. Are you happy to wait a second? Yeah, and then I'll come to you, and then we'll go to the Q&A in the chat, if that's right. I don't know if you guys wanted to, because that's the lovely thing about this event, and you guys can be in conversation with each other. So I don't know if you wanted to respond to any of those topics of stasis, or I'm looking at you, Alice, thinking maybe you will.
Yeah, and you're right, and I think that is just what's so interesting about taxidermy, is just this tension, I guess, between the stasis that is there and that people are trying to, I guess, kind of convey, but also these other stories that can be told. And like it just puts you always in a quandary about what you do. Like, how do you tell all of these stories at once, right? Because I know, as people working in these kind of areas, we always want to have a kind of clear narrative arc that holds an audience and keeps people there and has like a clear end and start. But with this kind of time stuff, it kind of disrupts that, right? Like, there isn't necessarily a clear end or start. Animals are both like static, but also kind of disruptive. They're both at the same time as representatives of incredible violence. But they can do these other things too. So there's something that I'm still kind of grappling with is how you tell all of those stories at the same time, without getting entirely muddled, essentially. But I think I guess that's where the good stuff is, but it's also where the challenge is to how do we talk about things like stasis, essentially. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Do you want to ask your question now? Thank you for waiting.
Thank you. I was interested in what you were talking about. I don't know how well you can hear me all the way from back there. I'm sorry, I'm literally around the room. When you were talking, Lisa, about like Ubery time and temporality, and you used the word slowness a lot as well towards the end. And I found that really interesting an approach in terms of like rejecting a very capitalistic structure of time that puts a lot of pressure on speed and productivity. Mm-hmm. But I was also wondering if at all, or how you find that those approaches might connect or relate to the mediums you work with. You mentioned that you work in printmaking, which is obviously quite a slow medium. Working in conservation, again, is working with things that have existed over a long period of time, and repairs. I don't know to what degree you work with conservation in that sense, or through curation. All of those things artistically are quite slow things. Versus like working with, I think it was also said that you were a digital artist, which compared to printmaking is relatively quick a medium of art. So I was wondering about how you relate to slowness and temporality, and whether there's a connection you feel between the temporality of the mediums you're working with and what you're thinking about with those things.
Lovely, thank you. I just want to check that you heard that okay, Lisa.
Yes, I did.
Okay, great.
And I started like trying to answer, and then I was like, okay, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, thank you. I think it does maybe relate. There's this artist who is based in Edmonton, who I really admire a lot, and she works in video, but she also works with seeds and plants, and her name is Christina Battle. So, and one thing that she said that really kind of solidified, well, connects the time and connects to your question in a way, or that I connect to your question, is she talked about, we talk about video when you work in video or film, or that's a time-based medium. It's durational. You have to sit there and watch it for however minutes it is. It's time-based, but she talked about her work with plants and seeds as time-based as well. And I thought, and that just really, I was so happy when she talked about that. And she works in, she has a science background, but is an practicing artist as well. And to answer your part, so I think it is related. I think that the work with plants has this time-basedness. And yes, printmaking is a slow process that very much tries your patience as well. And also I work in stop motion animation, which is a very slow process. And it's a frame by frame movement that it's like, I don't even want to say how long it takes to make 13 seconds of something, but I guess what the last part of that is that I was working, I collaborated with the late Sheila Kola, who was a conservation scientist who did very remarkable research on native bee conservation in Canada. And so I was working on those gardens, and she was thinking about pollinators, native bee pollinators specifically, but also informed me that butterflies are also pollinators in the beginnings of our collaboration. So, sadly, I'm not collaborating with her, but that we wrote a paper which is going to be coming out soon, which was about thinking about how my work in curatorial practice and trying to sort of disrupt, or sort of introduce ways that I've sort of disrupted the sort of colonial roots of that practice, and also her practice as a conservation scientist in conservation conventions, thinking about how she worked to influence and change the conservation conventions of, like, holding an ecosystem in some kind of true pure origin, those sorts of conventions. And so that's where conservation comes in, and how we put curatorial and conservation into conversation in a way. Anyway, so thank you for that question. Appreciate you. That's nice. Really nice question. Thank you.
We've got a couple more in the chat, and then we'll come back to the room, if that's, unless you guys wanted to jump in with anything just then. So we've got a couple more. One is we've got a comment and a question from one participant. So Nasaran Nadiri says, thank you for this inspiring session. In my own creative research, I'm developing a participatory walking art project, that sounds amazing, called Lalan in the north of Iran. Lalan means mute, when urban development, ecological loss and collective memory are explored from a more than human perspective. Oh God, sounds so good. And then a little bit further down, they've asked a question. So they said they really enjoyed this part of the conference and was deeply inspired by all the ideas presented. In particular, the attention to taxidermy and natural history museums, where non-human bodies are preserved yet silenced, was very thought-provoking. This perspective made me reflect on how modern human storytelling could be applied in artistic and research projects. Okay, so another sort of comment, but thank you very much for those. We did have a question, another one for Lisa from Iman Sultan West. Lisa, how do you find the interconnection between creative reflection and responses can be used to understand natural history? And how does this connect with radical care? I'm one of the Extinction Silences artists at the museum. I'm so inspired by your work.
So, yeah. Thanks. Well, I think there's I think having a creative reflection like that, I think that sometimes through art or through artist work practice, you can raise voices of people who maybe don't have a voice within the museum, within responding to natural history. I get the impression I get from the what Extinction Silences was about is sort of bringing more of a community perspective to these collections. Maybe the way those collections were created, but also the existence and the care of those collections still. Maybe what those this is my impression from the very short, but I think that I think if we think about radical care and maybe the work that you're doing in Extinction Silences, I think that that's part of bringing your own relations, your own community perspectives to that, and to be true to those, to not to I think the radical care is thinking about that process with whoever you're working with. I'm not totally sure of the process, I'm not sure of the community engaged kind of work that's happening, but I would say that radical care happens if you're working collaboratively. You're taking care of that group, you're doing kind of group and collective maintenance, as well as thinking about, yeah, I guess that's from what I know of the project, or what my impression is of the project, that's what I would say, that radical care has to do with the relations, bringing community perspectives, but also being careful with each other in that process. Because I know in responding to certain things in museums, there is sort of some violence behind that. And so I think there is a certain consideration around radical care. And I could probably give you more if I had more information, but you can always contact me if you want to talk about it. It's really nice to hear from an artist from that project, because it did stand out to me and I thought, oh, I wonder what that is. So thank you for the question.
Okay. Do you want to say anything on radical care, or?
Well, hi, Aman, and you need Aman on this panel as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Aman is absolutely fantastic, and I'm
Yeah.
sure we'll be hearing a lot more about their work.
Perfect.
And yeah, thank you for sharing, Lisa. That's also really, really valuable.
Amazing. Yeah, we have another couple of questions in the room. I'm going to go here and then.
Oh, brilliant question for everyone. I'll try and be brief because I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I just wanted to introduce Alison's assemblages, and I wondered if you could just speak a little bit about the how useful or not useful that is in a more than human conversation, particularly the kind of tension it introduces with traditional taxonomy kind of categorization.
Interesting. Thank you.
I could talk about assemblages a bit. So I think in my work, I would say it is useful, and I think the issues come in when you start thinking about, I guess, power and how kind of power is distributed. I think that's an issue people have always had when thinking about, we talk about things like entanglement, and we talk about things about how everything is, bound together. Like, how do you then equate for the very real presence of kind of human power and inequalities within that? And there are absolutely lots of ways around that. So I do talk about these kind of things. I talk about how everything is, interrelational, how everything is, how kind of in the world together, that these timelines are kind of intersecting, whatever it may be. But I think we need to take care, I guess, when we're doing that, to also pay attention to the power structures, and to not, as I kind of just said in the talk a little bit, not kind of flatten those. And I don't think there's a perfect way to do that, essentially. And it kind of comes back to those issues of, like, how do you create a coherent arc or narrative? But I do think it's a kind of really useful way into thinking about how everything is bound up together. But yeah, we need to pay attention to the historicization of stuff as well. So I guess where assemblages can kind of fall down is that they don't necessarily pay attention to history in some of the ways that they're written, and to change over the time, and continuity, and all of those things that are so important to how we've got here today, and to those kind of big questions of like responsibility, I guess. So great if we can do that at the same time, in a nutshell. Yep.
I'm aware, thank you so much, and thank you. And I'm just aware of time. We've got more questions in the Q&A, which is amazing, but I just wanted to come to you in the room as well.
Thank you. I guess this is more a question for Alice as well. But I would be interested to hear more about, I guess, the relationship to pristineness and feralness and the aesthetics of taxidermy. And I think I find myself thinking of Surgeons Hall Museum in Edinburgh when I was listening to you and thinking about like the display of disease and death that's curated there for the human, and just whether there are any examples in the non-human taxidermy world and history where I guess disease and difference is incorporated and in fact fits into the kind of aesthetic project that they were undertaking.
Oh, good question. Not in any of the work that I deal with, but probably yes, in kind of wider artistic efforts, right? In kind of modern artistic efforts, because so much about what I write. Something I write about in the book is about how people project human ideals onto animals, right? And lots of that is about the ideal human body, like having the perfect specimen that doesn't look in any way dead or in any way kind of distanced from life, right? You've got to kind of write out those processes of decay and degeneration. So I do think about that in terms of like how people project their own ideas around purity onto animals. And this is happening in this like mid 19th century context where you have the rise of germ theory and you have all of these anxieties around things like eugenics and racial science as well going on in the background, very much informing this kind of colonial practice. And what you get is people talking about preserving animal skins almost as if they're trying to preserve their own skin, right? So they're saying things like, oh, it's really vital that I protect these skins, and they are really worrying about insects coming in and causing this kind of degeneration. So I'm really interested in that kind of nexus of where like people's worries about their own health kind of leak into how they're describing skins, essentially. But this also relates to, I guess, kind of ideas around authenticity as well, because I guess across time you get other curators, and I've had this a lot, like looking at the work of previous taxidermists and deciding that they're like not good enough. So you've got this like changing idea of what the like perfect or the authentic or the like pure body is, and all of these taxidermists working with curators then try and unpick the work of previous people and get back to this like previous idealized state, which doesn't really exist because they're just reaching for something from their imaginations essentially. So I am really interested in like how bodies come into this, how this continued processes of unpicking and remaking come into this, and certainly ideas around like disease and health are definitely there, like simmering away in the background. If that answers that in any kind of way.
Yeah, definitely.
Amazing, thank you. I know, Kate, you had a question if we've got time, and then we've got amazing questions from Zakia Mackenzie as well. It's great to see you in the chat as well, and Frederick Needle. But yeah, Kate, do you want to ask your question there?
My apologies. I didn't mean to jump to the head of the queue.
Oh, no.
I can't access the Q&A function because I'm a host.
Worries.
Apparently hosts are not supposed to have questions. I was very struck by a particular way that you described something, Alice, but I think the question applies to all three presentations. Alice, you said that and forgive me if I haven't quite got the quote exactly. You said something about the nuisance-causing elements redirect our attention to the violences that created the display. And I find myself, as someone who writes about what one might call disturbance-loving species, or I love the phrase Isla adventive flora. I've never heard that one before. I'm going to start using it. It's much better than alien. I'm really interested in this idea of nuisance-causing elements and nuisance-causing species. So the insects that eat the skins, the plants in Mike McDonald's garden that refuse to stay in the place where they were planted, and bulbs, perhaps the the bulbs that actually sort of that come up on the opposite side of the path where they're not supposed to be, and you know, sort of the fixation with adventive flora. So I'm interested in. I'm wondering if I could ask you to speak about this idea of nuisance and how sort of an affect or an embrace of nuisance might actually be part of the repair work involved in galleries and museums.
Yeah, should I go first?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. I described this because I kind of wanted to lean into this idea that they are, you know, being disruptive, that they're not going along with, you know, the regime that they're meant to go along with, essentially. And I just thought that nuisance making kind of captured that nicely, because I'm trying to pay attention, I guess, to affect and emotion as it kind of played out. And I'm really interested in these anxieties that are felt by kind of colonialist hunters, essentially. And I wanted to give them a label that kind of gave them, that kind of represented their agency as even as dead things. And then I was, you know, I was a bit nervous about labeling them nuisance makers. Does it, you know, does it give them too much agency? Does it suggest certain things? Does it put them in a box? But then I thought, no, I'll just I'll just go with it. And then a kind of an argument that I make in the conclusion is that, you know, in a perfect world where museums had access to lots of funding, maybe some of these processes could be brought into like museum space, essentially. That, you know, those processes of production, telling stories about where animals came from, how they're put together to kind of reveal the Anthropocene layers, I guess, within things like taxidermy. And you can apply this to all kinds of things, right? Looking at production, looking at how things are constructed as a useful way into talking about origin stories, colonialism, whatever it may be. But then I also kind of suggest that maybe these processes of care that curators and taxidermists today kind of employ and deploy can kind of also be seen as part of that framework, right? That maybe in the curatorial space, you could bring in some of those ongoing processes in relation to animals that are highly valuable and highly vulnerable, right? Rare specimens that can tell these kind of stories. So maybe we could bring those nuisance causing elements into display space in an ideal world and tell those stories about present day environmental issues, essentially.
Amazing. I don't know if Isla and Lisa, you want to say something to that as well, and then that might be a nice place to wrap up.
Yeah, the plant collection. Well, it's interesting working with these. You know, we have these big narratives. We know a lot of problematic histories and backgrounds, but then this collection was collected by a mother and son who noticed and were interested in these plants that were growing in places we wouldn't normally maybe look for or notice plants or sort of glorify plants or focus in on those plants. So I think there's a lot of attention actually that also is given in the herbarium, the collection of pressed plants, to the kind of which doesn't you know, it's complex. There's lots of different reasons people are collecting. So sometimes you get this attention. And it was talking through this collection with a group from university and an artist. Have that real feeling of, you know, we talk about environmental crisis and destruction of nature, and here are these plants, and of course they're going to survive, and it's not like we actually have control. Of course we need to see plants and understand and think with plants, but to think that we have the kind of power and the domination, you know, it's a difference between taking responsibility and understanding our impact to sort of assigning ourselves the role of the future giver or not of these, you know, they're out with our systems essentially, and I found that actually really empowering to think through. So I'm not sure that quite answers your question, but there's lots of unexpected ways to think through, I think, these
nuisance makers in wasteland. It's like Michael Millay's book, Last Light, he talks about those plants in wastelands as well. Lisa, did you want to say something to that as well?
Sure. Yeah, I like that question that you're into the nuisance, Kate. I was thinking about the gardens in themselves in terms of being an art part of an art collection as kind of institutional critique and being a nuisance to the institution, as it demands the institution and workers to kind of extend themselves outside. Oh, I got it, and I imagine the condition. I can imagine the condition report for a garden, which I think ended up being kind of like a plant survey, which a